They have been called cuspers, zillennials, zennials, or even the Snapchat generation. They are the micro generation of individuals born on the cusp of the millennial and Generation Z demographic cohorts. They are micro they are the micro generation of individuals born on the cusp of the millennial and Generation Z demographic cohorts, those born between 1992 and 1998. They would have been babies or children at the time of the September 11th terrorist attacks, making them the first to experience adolescence in a post 9/11 world. Their outlook on life was further shaped by the Great Recession of 2008 and the COVID-19 pandemic. Additionally, this cohort witnessed the digital transition of the 2000s, from dial-up internet to high-speed mobile, from corded home phones to cell phones, and from home computers to mobile devices. The Zillennials are unlike any other generation that has come before or after them. Today, we discuss how they money. Ryan and Riley Hall are a young married couple that I met at last year's Chautauqua conference. Over the week I spent with them, I was continuously impressed with their ethos regarding money and life. They are in their late 20s and very much a part of the fringe between Generation Z and millennials. Ryan and Riley, welcome to Earn and Invest. Ryan, tell me, do you identify more with the millennial generation or the Gen Z generation, and why?
I would say that I I would say that identify with the millennial generation more than the Gen Z because I being introduced to money at a young oh man, can I start over?
Yep, just say three,
Okay.
two, one, and start again.
3, 2, 1. Jordan, I identify more with the millennial generation than Gen Z. I think because of being involved in technology and being interested in computers at a young age. I played around and built computers when I was young, like eighth grade. I was programming video game bots to play while I was at school. And I went through, I think, more of the technological advancements as they happen than maybe Gen Z would that grew up with iPads in their hands. So I think that I identify more with the millennials than I do Gen Z.
Riley, millennial or Gen Z? What is closer to your heart?
It's tough. It depends on which aspect of life you're talking about because with technology, I would say maybe more of a Gen Z, just because growing up, I had a lot of siblings, so we had a lot of different gaming apparatuses. We had Game Boys and Nintendos. We kind of went through the progression of technology in that sense, kind of playing that. Humor is kind of the same, at least for me, related to what I've seen of Gen Z. Millennial too, don't get me wrong, I definitely went through that whole like in high school, the mustaches on your finger and the weird quirky shirts. So I don't know that I can strictly pick one or the other. I think I'm a little bit of both depending on what we're talking about. Millennial, I think just going through school and kind of being the guinea pig for my family because I was the first of my dad's kids to go to college. I think that kind of made me grow up a little bit quicker along with other life circumstances, but that kind of grounded me a little bit more in the millennial space for that.
Ryan, we're going to talk in a little bit about how Zillennials specifically money as a group, but I want to talk about your childhood. Discuss with us the modeling that you grew up with. What kind of modeling did your parents pass on to you when it came to money?
I grew up in a more traditional Midwestern family where my dad went to work every day, a lot of times 6 days a week, usually 10-hour days, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom. So we were never by any means super well off. We didn't go on a lot of vacations. We didn't have a lot of disposable income. So in our family, we didn't talk about money a lot. I I knew that we had enough to have clothes on our back and food at dinner time and to go on the occasional road trip with the family once every few years. I was able to play all the sports I wanted to. I was able to, yeah, try any hobby I wanted to within reason, but we didn't talk about money. My dad grew up in a more rural community. His dad died when he was very young, and he grew up very poor, projects, single mom with 5 siblings. And so money was very taboo in my house, even between my parents, from what I understand. But I was young, so I can't really corroborate that. But it sounds like there wasn't a lot of overt discussion about money. So I found Dave Ramsey myself when I graduated college and realized how much debt I was in, and introduced it to my parents. So I probably got my hands around money and finances before my parents did. So the modeling was what I think is normal, but I don't know. Yeah, we didn't talk about money at all.
Riley, while Ryan talks about not discussing money at all, it sounds like money was much more traumatic in your upbringing. Talk about some of that trauma that you experienced.
Yeah, so it's funny because I didn't really think that the way I grew up was traumatic, at least while it was happening. It took me reaching my later 20s to kind of acknowledge, like, oh yeah, it wasn't just like, oh, I grew up different than other people. It's like, oh no, that was hard. That was really difficult. And I didn't really process it. And I'm sure I haven't processed everything. But, growing up, like I mentioned before, we had a lot of different like gaming devices. We had a bunch of toys. We literally had a room called the toy room. So we had everything that we really wanted. I mean, there were a few years where it's like Christmas is a little lighter, or we didn't do as much, but we never left the country or anything like that. We still did road trips as a family to Wisconsin. But what I didn't know was a lot of what was funding that was credit card debt, taking out a second mortgage on the house, a gambling issue going on in the background that I wasn't aware of. So all these things you're kind of blinded to as a kid because it's not things you know about. So all of that being funded, we eventually wound up losing one of my siblings due to a congenital heart disease. So we had that going on. My parents' divorce was finalized a month before she passed. My biological mother moved. So then it went from both of my parents and 5 kids in one house to my dad and 4 kids in a house. And then a couple years later, I want to say, so that happened in the 6th grade. So 5 years later, we were evicted from our house. So we went through all of that, and then all of this debt was kind of just accumulating, piling up in the background, and it was never really resolved. It was well, there's not much else I can do. The bank isn't accepting money for the mortgage anymore because we were so far behind. So we got evicted, lived with a neighbor for a year, eventually moved into an apartment, went through a lot of crappy vehicles, just really whatever could get us from point A to point B somewhat reliably. So that's a little bit of what we went through. So it looked like we had everything, but realistically, I think we were living like a lot of middle-class Americans at the time.
You should talk about the playing video games by candlelight, because you guys didn't have.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. Something like this I forget about.
Go ahead, start talking and I'll splice it in.
So growing up also, something that was normal to me then, and even to me now, because I don't think it's that big of a deal, but it really is when you think about it. There were a lot of times where we would have to take bird baths. For anybody who is familiar, I'm sorry. Bird baths is when your gas is cut off and you don't have hot water. So you are taking baths with a rag and a bar of soap in the sink, slashed around, because nobody wants to jump in a cold shower. That's kind of like your last resort. So a cold bird bath is the better way to go about it. And then also we'd have our electricity cut off. So we'd be playing games with our flashlights pointed up at the ceiling, playing board games with our siblings and my dad, and that was just kind of the norm. It happened more often than not.
Ryan, we've heard what Riley is talking about, her upbringing. You mentioned your upbringing. In fact, you were the one who found Dave Ramsey and brought it to your family. You two met, if I'm correct, in high school. As you started forming this relationship, eventually thinking about getting married, how did your beliefs about money intertwine, and did it cause stress in your relationship? Because you clearly had very different upbringings.
Yeah, so fortunately, we are still together after meeting in high school. Like you said, it was 2011 when we really started getting to know each other and dating. I had met her in 2009 because I had classes with her older sister, found out she had a cute sister, and then started telling her for the next 3 years that I was going to date her cute younger sister. And I did, and I married her. So Erin, if you're listening, gotcha. But in all seriousness, I knew I wanted to be an engineer at a young age, and my dad introduced me to technology. He didn't have any degree, any formal training. So on the weekends when my dad would work, I thought this was totally normal, was if he had to go in on a Saturday, he'd bring me with him, and that was definitely not allowed. So I'm not going to give any more details other than that, but he would introduce me to some automotive technology, like robots assembling cars and things that are happening that he said, hey, you won't have to be here on a Saturday. You see how those desks are all empty. If you become an engineer, you could be the one that programs this, and it all happens while you're gone. You won't have to do what I did. And I thought the robots were super cool. And I always looked up to my dad. He was a superhero to me. So I was like, yeah, that's great advice. I'm just going to do that. I'm good at physics. And I just decided then that it was what I was going to do. Thank goodness that was correct. So I had to take on about $70,000 of student loans to go to school because my parents made just enough money to not qualify for student aid. My scores were just too low to get any serious scholarships. So I got, 2/3 tuition covered because of my scores. I had what I thought was an amazing ACT score of a 30. And at my school, that was great. But at our school, the education system wasn't, or the education quality wasn't exactly high. It was, okay, good enough. So I had all these loans, didn't know what it meant, but knew that I made 70 grand a year now when I graduated and had a big boy job. And I needed to figure out what to do with the money because I was almost making as much as my dad did when I was growing up. And I realized I need to do something with this money. The other side of this that's important for that question is I had borrowed 50,000 of that from my parents because they saw the student loans were predatory interest rates. At the time, it was like 8% interest. And my dad said, that's like a crappy used car loan. I'm not letting you take $50,000. So we didn't do any vacations, anything fun for the 4 or 5 years. So the 1 year leading up to my college, and then the next 4 years, because my dad was cash flowing my school while putting nothing towards retirement. And that's sort of the part that is tough to swallow today, to be honest with you, is, I know the sacrifices they made, and now it's why I paid off my student loans in 3 years, because I owed it almost all to my parents. I had a realization they had no retirement accounts, and I wasn't going to be the reason that they didn't have any money. So found Dave Ramsey, started preaching it to them, got them on a plan, got my student loans paid off. And luckily, in that time, Riley was becoming an adult and her own person. I grew up and became my own person. And fortunately, she had student loans too that scared her. So even though our backgrounds were different, we were facing sort of the same struggle of, I have all these loans. I do not want to have this forever. I see it on TV of the millennial generation having all these loans, and I don't want to make that mistake of having it when I'm 50 or whatever.
Riley, did his message about Dave Ramsey speak to you too? Like, were you listening, hearing about the stuff about Dave Ramsey and saying, oh, that applies to my situation?
So I think when he first tried to introduce me to Dave Ramsey, I was still in school. So I was too busy and preoccupied to really care, which is funny. But then once I was in my last semester of school, he reintroduced me to Dave Ramsey, The Total Money Makeover. And I read it and I was like, wow, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Like, there's a way out, and I can pay for my student loans and I won't have to have this for 10 years, because part of my student loans, the majority of them actually, were in my dad's name because I couldn't take out enough money in my own name for student loans. I had to do a Parent Plus. For anybody who's familiar, the interest rates with Parent Plus are horrible. So when I was attacking my loans, that's the first thing I went after, was all of the loans that were in my dad's name. But yeah, it resonated with me once I actually took the time to read it.
Ryan, a lot of people start with Dave Ramsey, and at least in our community, then graduate to the financial independence, retire early movement or the FIRE movement. Was that a natural evolution for you to go from Dave Ramsey to FIRE? And how did you hear about FIRE?
Yeah, so this is a funny story. I gave a brief summary in the Chautauqua Earn and Invest podcast episode. So if you haven't listened to it, do it now. So I work in an area where the cost of living is pretty low and the incomes are relatively high. And when I took this job that I took, I didn't realize that was actually the case. So I made friends with my coworkers, and I have a pretty outgoing personality. I'm learning I'm a people person, which is weird for an engineer, but I guess that's the case. I've been in and out my whole life. So I was talking with some coworkers one day, and one coworker had a particularly aggressive type of personality. When I say that, his sense of humor was crass. Like, he would poke fun at you without making it seem like a joke, but he is kidding. So it could definitely rub you the wrong way. And he did initially, but I owe him a lot, because he said, we had gotten our bonuses, and he came up to me and said, "Hey, did you max your 401k with your bonus?" And I said, "No." And he goes, "What, are you scared?" And I'm like, "What am I scared?" And he's like, "Yeah, what, are you scared to max your 401k?" He's like, "I know where you live. I know how much money you make. I know you can max your 401k. Why aren't you?" And I was irritated by that comment, because I'm like, "What, am I scared? I'm a 24-year-old man. You're not going to tell me I'm scared." I had a little bit of ego action going. I went to two of my coworkers who were better friends and less jerky, and both of them said, I said, "Are you maxing your 401k?" And they both said yes. And I'm like, okay, so clearly I'm the weird one here. And I went home and I started Googling, do people actually max their 401k? And I found Mr. Money Mustache's World Domination Summit from Seattle. And he also was like, if you actually give a shit, you'll save 50%. And I was like, I'm getting attacked from all angles. Apparently I'm the problem, and I'm going to learn this. And it just sent me down a rabbit hole that eventually led to the FI community.
So, Riley, you guys are exceptional. Your stories are exceptional. Your upbringing is exceptional. Your views on money are also exceptional. But what I also want to talk about a touch today is the fact that you really are at that cusp between millennial and Gen Z, and this forms its own little micro generation that is exceptional unto itself, partially because of all the crazy things you guys lived through while you were growing up. So let's talk about Zillennials, or if you want to call them cuspers, or I love calling you the Snapchat generation. It has been said, or this generation has been described as being raised less by optimistic boomers and more by skeptical Gen Xers who raise you to focus more on practical rather than aspirational. So that's the first thing I kind of want to talk about. Practical versus aspirational. Sounds like Zillennials get that a little from Gen X. Do you think that's right on? Like, do you see that your peers are definitely more practical? Because I think the millennials might be more aspirational, or excuse me, I think the Gen Zers might be more aspirational. Maybe the millennials are more practical. I don't know. Where do you see yourself falling?
So for me, I definitely think I'm more practical, and I do believe that a lot of that has come from Gen X, because when you're talking about going off to school, because that was your only option, it was go off to school or go work in a factory, basically. That's at least what I was hearing other parents echo. And as soon as it's so built into your thinking, when parents and adults from the Gen X generation are telling you that as soon as someone says, "I want to be an artist," it's like, well, what are you actually going to do? You're not going to make money doing that. And it's like, wow, okay, you're going to be a starving artist. And it's like, no, it's not the case. But you get it almost beat into you as you're growing up. You need to be practical. You need to prepare for the future. And it's okay, well, what can I do that will actually earn me money throughout my life? Something that's going to be sustainable. So I think in that regard, I'm definitely more millennial.
Ryan, practical. I don't think you can get more practical than Dave Ramsey, right? I mean, does Dave Ramsey, you think, speak to this Zillennial generation, to your peers and cohorts?
So, Jordan, I think you're onto something, but I do not think that's the case. So I think he speaks directly to millennials. And I think that most cuspers or Gen Z are a lot less religious based. And Yeah, Dave Ramsey. I've introduced a lot of people my age, Dave Ramsey, and the immediate pushback is this guy's just a Bible thumper. Like, I can do money and God separate, thanks. And honestly, that is a pretty fair pushback because it excludes a lot of people. I mean, there's a lot of reason to have a lot of voices in the fire community, and I think that's a huge gap for him is just beating this borrower slave to the lender because the Bible says so thing, rather than just being practical and fully practical and saying, you know, whatever, like the math says this rather than Jesus said to or whatever. And I'm not a religious person at all. So that, but I kind of, being an engineer, I just approached it like, I'm going to ignore that part. Thank you. And I just kept moving, but it turns a lot of people off. So I think there's a lot of people out there who do a much better job of targeting Gen Z and cuspers. Like there's a few YouTube channels like Caleb Hammer and like Graham Stephan that sort of preach the same message but remove the religion, and I think that's a much sweeter spot for our generation.
Riley, it's interesting as Ryan talks about that. I'm reminded of something else that's said about Zillennials. It is that diversity and independence are the traits used most often by the cohort to describe what will set their microgeneration apart. So diversity and independence, is that something you feel this group kind of connects with?
I would say so, because I feel what a lot of people are looking for in that cusping generation is something that sets them apart from everyone else. So if you're doing exactly what everybody else is doing, how are you different? How are you special? Like, what makes you you? And I think that could be a really great motivator for some people and get them asking questions that will make them different. And I think for others, it makes them, it could be a detriment to them. And it's like, well, what's the point? I'm not special. And they start hinging themselves on, I need to find this one thing that defines me as a person. And as a person, you are a multitude of different things and personalities. You don't have to just be this flat one surface type of a person. But as far as diversity, I think especially millennials and Gen Xers, definitely baby boomers, I don't think diversity was really ever a conversation. It wasn't something that was talked about. And now growing up, especially now being in the corporate world, that's something that's focused on very heavily. And it's something you're aware of because you hear all of these very crass comments about whether it be race, gender, ethnicity, for absolutely no reason. We're not treating people as people anymore. It's you're this one trait and that's all I see. And this is how I identify that trait, whether it be positive or negative. And it's really sad, but yeah, I think Zillennials, cuspers, we just see things differently. We're more open to different ideas and ways of life than maybe other generations are.
Yeah, and I think that's the part of that, especially the cusper thing. So we just talked about practicality with money, but that this is the sort of like more, what was the word? The aspirational piece is we want to be special. We want to include everybody. We want to make this world a better place. So I think that is a good, we're very practical with like career decisions and money, but then, yeah, we have this aspirational piece that's, I want to include other people. I do want to be independent. I want to be an individual rather than what you see and that be my entire classification.
Ryan, Riley talked about this a little bit at the outset of this conversation, but I want to come back to it. Zillennials and technology. It's been said that they are comfortable with technology and social media, but also acknowledge that it's a love-hate relationship. Talk to me about technology in your generation.
Yeah, that's actually a very timely question. So you call us the Snapchat generation. I like that one too. Me and my best friend Tyler had a 5-year snap streak. That means that you send a Snapchat every single day for 5 years straight without a single day in between. So that included the week in Colombia with you, Doc G. That included the 2 weeks in Thailand. I mean, it included a lot of life in 5 years. We both got married. So technology in my generation, I think we grew up with kind of right as like the Motorola Razr became popular. We were in high school, but then smartphones started happening. But I was in college when smartphones got big. So I remember my younger brother having a nice smartphone when I was in school, and he had all these apps on it and did all kinds of things on his phone and spent hours on his phone every single day. And I did not understand it because I'd never had a smartphone like that. I was in engineering school trying to do my best because I felt like I needed to work very hard because I was spending a ton of money. And then you get into the workplace, everybody has smartphones. I started to learn how to use a smartphone, and then work starts to have expectations of having certain apps on your phone and be able to get a hold of you at any time. And I have trouble not paying attention to my phone when it lights up now over me getting used to technology. So I'd be at the gym working out, mid-workout, really enjoying it, and then my phone lights up and it's a work message. I would stop my workout to answer, and it sort of like fragmented my attention, made my workout suck, but I took care of work. So actually recently we each bought a separate phone and phone line so that we could have a separate phone for work and not put any of the work apps on our phones, because I cannot physically, I'm way too type A to stop to wait till later. Once I see something pop up, I need to take care of it. So I just leave that phone at home. I leave that phone in the car, whatever, and I can actually like compartmentalize my life a little better. And that sort of thing, I thought it was hilarious. My dad always had a work phone, 2 physical phones, and now I'm that guy. So anyway, I think that kind of is a good example of where we stand in the technology space.
We are talking to Ryan and Riley Hall. They are part of the micro generation called Zillennials, individuals born on the cusp of the millennial and Generation Z demographic cohorts, people also born between the years of 1992 and 1998. And we are discussing how they money. We're going to take a short break. I'm Doc G, and this is the Earn and Invest podcast. All right, I'm going to read us back in a moment. I love this conversation, by the way. I love this conversation. So I'm going to jump right back in, and we will get going on 3, 2, 1. Welcome, Brett. Welcome back. We are talking to Ryan and Riley Hall, who are part of the Zillennial generation. Their outlook on life was shaped by the Great Recession of 2008 and the COVID-19 pandemic. Additionally, this cohort witnessed the digital transition of the 2000s from dial-up internet to high-speed mobile, from corded home phones to cell phones, and from home computers to mobile devices. Riley, tell us about the cuspers and how they look at money. Are Zillennials good with money?
I think it depends on who you talk to. Funny enough, today I was having a conversation. My work just had interns come in for the summer, and I started talking to them a little bit about money, and they were the first ones to bring it up. So they were both actually debt-free, and they're in school. They're both going to be entering their junior year next year. So they're already on a great start, but they both view money very differently and have very, I wouldn't say different work ethics, but I would say maybe their expectations of themselves in work. One of them works maybe 2 jobs during the summer, working up to 80 hours a week. And the other one would just work, maybe standard 40, maybe a little bit less than that. Still work hard, both of them, I'm sure. But one of them was talking about how she's not good about saving her money. And the other one's like, I've never spent my money, and that's my problem. So I think it really depends on how their parents grew up, or maybe the teachings that their parents had, because it's just such a interesting dynamic. Either they can be very strict and stringent with their money, or they can, fall victim to maybe some of the social media advertising and some of that shopping therapy.
Ryan, let's talk about social media. I mean, Instagram, Snapchat, all of this really came to fruition as your generation was growing up. We are all involved in this financial independence movement. We are somewhat conservative when it comes to money. We like to save more and spend less. And yet your generation really grew up with FOMO and YOLO. Those were words that we didn't really use until maybe the last 10 years. How do you think social media has affected your generation's feelings about money?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it has warped a lot of people's money habits because there's this sort of like like you said, YOLO. There's a sort of like invisible pressure to put off this image that you're finally making it, that you went to school, you got that job. Now, where is the visibility to why you did that? Plenty of people go straight out of high school, get a decent job at the post office or UPS, make plenty of money, and look like they have more because they're flexing their BMW payments or whatever. I do think that Facebook particularly is funny because Zoomers don't, or Gen Z doesn't understand Facebook, that we all use it. So I'm more millennial in that space, that when somebody said, I don't have a Facebook, what do you mean no one uses that? I thought, I was like personally offended. I've recently gotten rid of all social media, and because again, similar thing, type A, lots of distraction, and I want to be able to focus on things that are important. So I think a lot of people, at least in our cohort, are starting to trim the social media and start to get rid of Snapchat, get rid of Instagram, get rid of Facebook, because we are getting to adult age where we realize that there is no one's really watching what we're doing. No one cares what people from the Midwest that have decent jobs have driving in traffic. No one's looking. No one cares. Your aunt might think it's cool that you drive a BMW, and congratulations if that's the case, and if you really wanted it. But I do think that there's sort of a pressure to explain why you're not spending your money among cuspers and millennials too, rather than a no one talks about money situation.
I would say for cuspers and Gen Z in particular, with the creation and use of TikTok, I think money has become a very interesting topic of conversation, and it has become very saturated with terrible advice. There's a lot of day trading TikToks, get rich quick schemes. I thought that a lot of the Ponzi schemes or MLMs had kind of died off, but it seems like there's almost a resurgence of them again because everybody wants to just get rich quick. Nobody wants to work the standard 9 to 5 or, you know, do a very physical job to earn their money. They just want to have it. It doesn't matter how they get there, it seems. It's like, well, whatever gets me there fastest. And they don't necessarily understand what it means to invest. To them, investments are putting money in the stock market, single stock, and day trading.
It shows my generation, Generation X, that when I started talking about social media, I mentioned Instagram and Snapchat and didn't even mention TikTok, by the way. Riley, let's look at the other side of that. We talked about some of the problems with social media, but the other thing that's really happened, I believe, during your generation is fintech, right? Things like Robinhood and even Vanguard and Mint and all of these different apps you can use. How do you think your generation has been affected by fintech? Has it generally been positive or negative?
I would say it's generally positive. People are using those types of apps in a way to improve their financial situations or make them feel better about their financial situations. Whether or not they stick with it, something like Mint, where you're tracking where all your spending is going. I find that our generation can be very streaky at times, where it's like, okay, I'm dedicated to this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to plan out my budget. I'm not going to spend an X category, and I'm going to save this much. And then after a month, once the initial serotonin or dopamine wears off, it's back to normal habits. And then with other people, I think something like Acorns, for instance, it makes you feel good. Like, oh, I'm saving this extra 32 cents from this bill that I had paid, or, you know, whatever. So it's like, okay, well, I have money that I'm saving. But then you take a step back and you look at how much you've saved over the past month. And it's like, you could be saving a lot more if you trimmed fat. So it's that false sense of, oh, well, I have savings. And it's like, you have $72 in your Acorns account and you have a negative balance on your credit card.
Ryan, we've talked a little bit about the fact that the Zillennials have seen lots of things in the last 20 years and dealt with some trauma like the pandemic and the 2008 recession. One thing that we've seen from the Great Resignation is a move towards things like digital entrepreneurship. I think people associate that somewhat with the Generation Zers, but do you also think that that applies to your cohort too, the Zillennials? This idea that I can go out and do it on my own. Maybe I can start my own business. The internet is a big, vast place, and we should be taking advantage of it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think Gen Z that resonates more with, and I think it has to do with the 2008, 2009 financial crisis. So being a cusper, you were old enough to see what was happening in 2008, 2009, but you weren't old enough to be working at the time. So there's sort of more scarcity, at least in myself. I don't want to speak for everybody. Everybody's experience was different, but in myself, there's definitely an underlying scarcity piece at play that would say, don't take that risk and start that business. No one on the internet's going to care. Whereas I think Gen Z growing up with, like Riley said, TikTok, and I mean, they know people in real life who are making real money just making short videos about whatever they know about. So they're a little bit more open to that idea of I could do this and I'm gonna and I will figure it out. And the idea of layoffs and market segments disappearing and financial crisis, not being able to get a loan for a car or something that simple, or your credit limit dropping significantly overnight. Those sorts of things, literally, I do not think processes as a possibility for a lot of people in that Gen Z. So it sort of removes internal barriers. I, from my perspective, that's not recognizing risk, but that is probably because I'm a little bit warped from seeing that sort of, financial crisis.
Riley, are Zillennials career oriented? I mean, I'm thinking from my generation, Gen Xers, we are very good employees, right? We wanted to grind it out, walk up that corporate ladder. We expected to work 50, 60-hour work weeks. How do you think it is for the Zillennials?
I think for Zillennials, a lot of us aren't identifying ourselves as our career, but then again, we are still feeling that pressure of go to school. You need to know what you're doing and what you're going to study and what you want to do for the rest of your life as soon as you start going to school. So you have that underlying anxiety of, well, I don't know who I am. I don't know what I want to do for the rest of my life. I'm 18. Like, what am I supposed to do? So you kind of get shoehorned, maybe by yourself or by pressure from, your elders of, okay, well, I'm going to study this because I know it's good, and it's not necessarily what they want to do or something that they are going to be able to sustain. So I think if Zillennials find something that they're passionate about, whether it be through having gone to school or join the trades or being able to make it as a digital entrepreneur, I think they do make really good employees. They just know how to set that balance and that limit of, this is work. Work is not going to bleed into my home life. I want to have a personal life. So they know when to quit, and they give their employer exactly what they said that they would give them and nothing more.
Ryan, Zillennials are really reaching their upper 20s, right around 30. This is the prime of your career. This is like when people start making more money. They start moving up the corporate ladder if they're in corporate America. It's really one of those prime moments in your work and money-making life. I want to talk about two things going on right now and how you think they're going to impact you as a Zillennial. The first one is AI. How do you think AI is going to impact the careers of your peers?
I think AI is going to sort of serve as a mechanism that's going to remove the bottom rungs of employment and job opportunities. And I don't mean that in a flagrant and meaning. I just mean that it's sort of entry level jobs and low skill jobs that are sort of like, look this up for me, or put this on my calendar for me, or can you dig through and find that email, like sort of like secretarial or administrative or even entry level like data analysis and data entry jobs. I think we will see those get significantly downsized with the use of AI. I think more technical and more skilled jobs will sort of use AI as leverage to get more done with less people. I think it's similar to you seeing like McDonald's having automated things to put together burgers, or and typically driven from minimum wage increases or whatever. I think it's a similar mechanism.
Riley, the other thing going on right now as Zillennials are really hitting their prime is this idea that the equity markets are going to be crap for the next 10 years, right? There's a lot of people saying, boy, equity returns just aren't going to be very good. Are the Zillennials a little screwed here? I mean, this is when they're just coming into money. Are we looking at like years of party time in the stock market that's now going to end for the next decade?
I personally don't feel a doom and gloom when it comes to the market. I'm sure there's going to be a stint of not great returns, but I mean, look at the past 10 years. We knew this was coming. And of course, for Millennials and Gen Z, it can feel a little bit like a slap in the face. It's like, okay, cool. As soon as I enter the workforce, now things start getting crappy. And it's, it's a give and take. It's not always going to be up and up and up, and it's not always going to be stagnant or on a downturn. So like I said, I don't feel a doom and gloom. I'm sure some people hear the parrotings in the news of this is the worst the stocks have ever been since whatever. I don't know why I chose that accent, but there you go. But it's just a lot of scare tactics, I think, is what's kind of driving some feelings towards how the market is in general. I don't know that it's necessarily I've done some research, looked into this because these are the situations that I'm going to come up into in the next 5 years. It's just kind of a echo chamber of everybody else's feelings on what's going on in the market, not necessarily Gen Z or Millennials.
I would like to understand, Doc G, why you pitched that as a bad thing if the market would be flat for 5 years while we're making a lot of money, because that would just be a powder keg of possible future returns and wealth. I mean, I'm hoping it stays flat for 5 years while we're hitting our prime for earning, because I'm going to have a hell of a lot more money.
Yeah, actually, the truth is, right, the millennials and Gen Xers who are looking towards retirement may actually see this as more of a problem. That actually is,
Right.
is a very good point. Which brings me kind of to the last question of the conversation, Ryan. What do you think the future is going to be for Zillennials? Are you optimistic?
I'm very optimistic, at least in my experience. The pandemic's been really a blessing, and that sounds horrible to say now, but I'd like to explain. So there was a lot of boomers and older Gen Xers in the company I work in, I think across the industries, that were sticking around working, that had pensions that were sort of like grandfathered in, that were working just until they get screwed with enough to where they'd leave. And many of them saw their sort of one step up cohort get laid off with payouts in 2008, 2009, and markets go in cycles. So they were sort of just sitting ducks waiting for the possible payout, and we're just going to ride off into the sunset in their Corvette to Florida. But I think that the pandemic, the health risks of having to be on site, and sort of the realization that, wow, life shut down for a while. I don't know why I'm still working when I don't need to. There has been a mass exodus of people who are in the, upper 40s and onwards in retirement, which has left really big gaps for opportunities for people in our cohort where we aren't brand new, don't know a lot. We have, 8 to 10 years of experience, but we wouldn't normally in traditionally be open or considered for these roles. But since there's nobody better, it's just sort of we'll get you up to speed, we'll get you there. And that's sort of another blessing and something I'm very thankful for, because I'm more on the millennial side of work ethic. I really enjoy working hard. I love working. It's something that it feels very good to me. And I can do that, get recognized, see opportunity, get recognized for seeing that and going after things. And there's big openings. So it's sort of, my career is progressing significantly faster than I expected it to. Riley and I had a conversation the other night that we're each making, more than $10,000 a year more than we thought we would be by now. And if you think about the numbers and how little we spend, that's straight to our net worth. So it's been a really, really exciting time, I think, at least from my perspective.
Riley, looking back decades from now, what do you think the Zillennials will be known for?
I think that they will be known for setting limits. They are very passionate. They love the things that they love and they want to spend their time doing that. And so with work, if they are fortunate enough and their company is fortunate enough to have them and they're passionate about their work, that's going to pay dividends for both the company and for them. But if they're, just okay, they're, satisfied with their job and they have passions outside of work, that's going to give them a much fuller life. And I think that's what they're going to be known for, is really taking a look at what things do I want in life and trying to go after them, because they didn't have the, you have to be practical, you have to go by the book, you have to do it in this order of go to school, graduate, get a job, get married, have kids, die. It's go to school, get a job, travel the world, come back, make money to live and hopefully save. I'm hoping that Gen Z and Millennials are saving towards retirement and be able to retire early. The two people I referred to earlier today, the interns, they're Gen Z, and I'm trying to introduce them slowly to FI so it's not overwhelming, because I know they're still students and they still have 2 years before they even graduate and see a salary. But just getting that in their mind, I'm hoping that the Gen Z and Millennials that are starting to see these messages start digesting it and thinking about it and start trying to apply it to their own lives so that they have a better future.
Well, Ryan and Riley, I wanted to thank you for coming on the show today. When we talk about the Zillennials, we often compare them to millennials versus Gen Zers because they are right there in the middle on the fringe. But actually, when I start thinking about it, I start thinking that probably a lot of who the Zillennials are today actually has more to do with their parents, the boomers and the Gen Xers, and how they've influenced them. So when we're talking about these things like practicality versus aspirationality, right? When we're talking about technology versus non-technology, independence versus codependence, I think this spans all sorts of different generations and probably speaks more to the modeling that we receive as kids than necessarily where we fall in that generational timeline. On the other hand, I think Zillennials are incredibly diverse and knowledgeable about diversity, as well as, Riley, what you were saying, this idea that they're probably more likely to go after what they want. And part of the reason is that Zillennials came of age with just such huge and gigantic change, with economic tail and headwinds, with the pandemic, all of this happening at once really gave them a sense of going after what they wanted because there were so many things going on that they probably couldn't change or affect. I wanted to end this episode the way I end every episode by asking you specifically what is coming up next in your life, Riley. And then Ryan will go to you if people want to get in touch with you. Is there a way to do that? So first and foremost, Riley, what is coming up next in your life?
Oh, geez. Well, at the end of this month, we have our first road trip with our dogs. We recently adopted a senior Chihuahua. He's 10. He's the cutest. But we're going to take a road trip to go see one of our fellow Chautauquans in Ohio. And then from there, we're going to continue our road trip down to North Carolina to go see some family of mine.
And Ryan, if people want to reach out to you, what is the best way for them to do that if they have questions?
First, if you have a reason to reach out to us, I'd ask you to look in the mirror and think about why. No, I'm just kidding. If there's any reason to try to get a hold of us, I guess if it's possible, if you could reach out through Doc G, he could get you in contact with us, get you our cell phone numbers, and we'd be happy to text, call, chat, whatever. The world's a small place, and we're a lot less interesting than you think we are.
I don't know if I agree with that. I mean, part of the reason I wanted to have you on is because I was so impressed with you when I first met you while we were at Chautauqua, which is a conference that last year was in Columbia. Basically, I got to spend time with you and learn about who you are. And it really got me interested in your age group, which made me think a lot about the Zillennials in general. Thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for being part of this conversation. Riley and Ryan Hall, thank you for coming on Earn and Invest.
No problem, Doc G. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
That's a wrap. As you guys know, I keep things running just for a few minutes to catch our after show. Yeah, I think being on the cusp of two different generations gives you such a really unique look at things. And I think you do end up having bits of each generation. And then, like I said, I think also because you're on the cusp, your parents were probably also on the cusp. So you get all these different things affecting your beliefs. An interesting time to grow up. You guys really did. Like, I feel like I grew up in the 70s and 80s and it was fairly boring, right? I don't feel like we had such big traumatic things happen.
Yeah, and it's funny because at least for me, I feel like what we grew up with was normal. I mean, obviously 9/11, the economic downturn, not normal events, but it's just what happened. And also with your closing statements, to go back to that, when you were talking about how we are really like the generation before us, or maybe two generations before us, at least in some regard, it reminded me of something I've heard of recently, a term called generational trauma. And I
Yeah.
wonder if that's part of the reason why we have
Yeah.
some of those traits.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, look, a lot of millennials feel like economically they were screwed, right? Because a lot of them really
Yeah.
came of age during the 2008 recession. And I think a lot of Gen Zers are kind of like, screw it. I'm, like, I'm going to focus on what's important to me. And maybe I'm going to take a different path. Maybe I'm going to be a TikToker. Maybe I'm going to do that. And I love it because I think you guys are right there in between. So you get a little bit of both of those sensibilities. But again, I think you also have some of the Gen X sensibilities, like when it comes to work and grinding it out, doing the really hard work. But then I think you also do have a little bit of the baby boomer stuff too. So it makes an interesting mix.
Yeah, I'm very thankful to have grown up when we did. And outside of the generational thing, both of us growing up in, like, I'll say middle class or lower middle class. I mean, you said that we come from very different backgrounds, but it feels very similar. Our ideas of bougie are very, very, very different than most people that are listening to this, probably. I mean, so anyway, our idea of fun is a lot less expensive, and that's sort of like scarcity, just growing up with not knowing. It allowed, like, Christy and Bryce's book Quit Like a Millionaire to resonate with us a lot. We read that book. That was seriously we're doing this. I read the book in like 2 days and I rented it from the library. I returned it, ordered it on Amazon, gave it to Riley, said, you got to read this. She read it and she's like, we're doing this. And it's been literally, if you look at our Empower, which is Personal Capital now, or it's the new name. And if you look at January of 2020, when we read the book, very good timing to get travel credit cards. Christy, thanks for that horrible advice at that time. Anyway, if you look at our net worth from that date, it inflects up significantly, and it has been a rocket ship since, even though the market's been down. So I don't know. I'm very thankful that we both have the parents that we have. We did a lot of talking about how, there was some challenges and we didn't have a lot growing up. There wasn't a lot of privilege there, but that's sort of our superpower. We didn't have a lot. We got encouraged to go after something that could make a lot of money. And now we just make all that money and we don't spend any of it. So it's awesome.
Well, we also didn't have social media influencing our spending habits either. So I think that was something that really worked in our favor. We got to see technology evolve, but not feel such significant impacts on it so early on, like a lot of the Gen Z is.
It's hard, I haven't gone in depth about specifically where you grew up, but I think some of, like, when you talk about what you see as bougie or not, I think some of that's geographical. It's just where in the country you grew up surrounded by what you grew up surrounded by.
We learned that in Colombia at Chautauqua, when we realized that a $200,000 house was a shack. Other places in the Midwest, it is not.
Yeah.
And that having a Tesla isn't really a status symbol some places anymore. And we're like, are you serious? I know one person with one.
Yeah. But it's interesting because, again, I met you in Colombia, right? And you went to Thailand. So it's not like you guys are very sophisticated people. I know they both, you can't see this, but on the video, their faces both kind of like their eyes lit up. But I mean, that's fairly sophisticated.
Yeah, and we flew out of the same airport as you. We didn't have any idea. So we met you in Colombia. We were driving distance the whole time. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And that's the other thing is how geographically different. Like, so I grew up in a very close to Chicago in the suburbs in a fairly affluent area. So lots of Teslas around here, lots of international travel, lots of that stuff. It's just, so it's also interesting adding that to when you were born, who you were born to, what specific, modeling you had growing up, but then also geographically where you grew up too. Yeah, I mean that it all adds little bits of flavor into how you end up being as an adult. And I think in your cases, it's done really exceptional things.
Well, that is a compliment, and I don't know why your judgment's so poor, Dr. Eno.
Well,
I've
your
been known for poor
comments-
judgment. No, I'm kidding.
Your comments on the geographical location having an impact on our views of money or bouginess reminded me of an article that actually Ryan sent me that Mr. Money Mustache wrote, which was pertaining to having cities designed around walking ability and not driving. And I was like, man, can we get one of those? Like, imagine people growing up and that's the way of life. I feel like that would be so impactful, and your view on people and just the world would be so different. I'm up for living in a community like that personally.
And one more thing, I just realized while Riley was talking that it sounds like I'm her secretary, or that I'm like procuring information. I'm just the nerd of the two of us, and when I see something worth like reviewing that I think she'll like, I send it along. So there's not a weird dynamic here. I'm just a dork and I read everything I can.
All right. Well, this will probably come out, I think, in 3 to 4 weeks. I'll edit it up and send you guys a copy before, but I think it's going to turn out really well, and I'm real happy with the conversation.
Yeah, me too. You picked really good questions and top conversation. That was
Yeah,
nice.
you're good at this, Doc G.
Yeah.
I try. I think to me, it's just a fascinating topic.
Yeah.
And as I thought about it more and more, I'm like, oh, you guys are the ones to have that conversation with. So, all right. Have a good night.
You too.
Yeah,
Thanks,
you
Doc
too.
G.
Take it easy. Thank